we're going to take a look at the Declaration of Independence in this video and examine the purposes of the Declaration of Independence and some of the accomplishments, and also try to understand what was behind the ideas in this declaration. Now, the Declaration has been very controversial, but it's been used throughout American history as a way to describe the ongoing kind of progression of citizenship in the United States. Abraham Lincoln believed that the Declaration of Independence really was much more of a founding document than the Constitution, and the Constitution was incomplete without the Declaration of Independence because of the idea of all men being created equal. It didn't seem to equate with slavery. Frederick Douglass also, in his great essay about the 4th of July, essentially said that the 4th of July could never mean anything to African Americans, particularly slaves, until that realization of all men being created equal was achieved. And of course, at multiple points during the civil rights movement of the 1900s, in the 50s and 60s, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also made reference to the Declaration of Independence as being the guide for which we would end segregation and give equal voting rights to all, so that all men would be created equal. So this has been a document that throughout American history has been used at various times to talk about progress and to get us a little bit farther along. I'd like to delve into it a little bit more and take a look at some of the cardinal principles behind it, what they were thinking about at the time. Now, if you take a look at the Declaration of Independence, we all know it was written by Thomas Jefferson. However, if you examine it, Jefferson essentially didn't write all this language himself. What he did was an excellent job in sitting down and kind of getting together the ideas that were floating around the colonies at that point in time and assembling them into one succinct document that outlined what the problems were that we had with King George III and the way that the British were exercising power against America. So in looking at this, what we saw was there had already been, at this point in time, in July 1776, there had already been a number of colonies who declared their statehood and also came up with their own constitutions. Some of what we find in the Declaration was actually written into those new constitutions. At this point in time, one of the ways in which people shared political views was oftentimes through political sermons in various churches. Some of that comes out of this. And then, of course, just in general, things that were being published as tracts or in newspapers. So as we see this, don't just view it as something Thomas Jefferson himself came up with. This was really the thinking of all the colonies at this point in time. And some of their just kind of general distress over the way that the government was being operated against them. But Jefferson does eloquently put all these ideas together in one tight, succinct document. So we give him credit there, but he didn't originate all of these ideas. So let's take a look at what the Declaration of Independence does. I think there are three main areas that we can take a look at that the Declaration accomplishes. One, it creates a new nation, right? And essentially says that we're going to be splitting from Britain and that we will be a new country. Now, exactly what it means to be that new country isn't 100% clear when you read the document, because at some points it says that we're united, but we're independent states, and these United States of America, but then at other times these free independent states. So it definitely is saying that we're splitting from Britain and that we're going to be something different. Exactly what that isn't entirely clear, but probably a new country. But that certainly was open for debate and might not have happened. Second of all, it defines the purposes of government. And oftentimes when you take a look at the Declaration of Independence, you see it as a list of grievances. This is what's being done wrong right now. But if you flip that over, you've got an entirely different situation going on. If somebody says, I don't like the way government is operating because I believe this is being violated, what you're really saying is, I think this principle is very important. And it's one of the primary things that government should be doing, but it's being violated right now. So we can take a look at each one of these grievances less as just saying people getting mad at the way government's operating, and more as something that is really what is important to them for the way the government itself should operate on behalf of the people. And interestingly enough, we'll see a lot of the principles that are in the Declaration of Independence re-arise both in the Articles of Confederation as well as the US Constitution. So these were really kind of foundational ideas of what the founders thought government should be about. And then it kind of lists some of the important facets of government. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through the document. But first of all, is the idea of deliberative government. In other words, government coming together, trying to solve people's problems by working through ways to solve them. And I think one of the ways that you can see that this is most written into the Declaration of Independence is the almost constant discussion of legislative politics and the need to have legislatures to do the people's will. And they don't like the arbitrariness of the way that forces on behalf of the King of England are operating in the US. Rather, they want this kind of representative process through assemblies. Second of all is the need to have an independent judiciary. They make the argument that King George III basically was using the judiciary to do whatever he wanted rather than to be a neutral arbiter between the people and the government. So the importance of an independent judiciary really kind of comes out of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we'll see that by giving the judiciary its own branch of government when we get to the US Constitution. Third thing is the rule of law. And that is that, our deliberative government should come up with rules of the game, the way that the government operates, and those should apply equally to everybody. And the arbitrariness of the way that the king operated was very much at odds with what the colonists thought were their rights as, at that point at least, being British citizens. So this idea of rule of law rather than rule of an individual, just arbitrarily at my whim, I can do whatever I want, that was contrary to what the founders believed. And then finally, the founders basically said, in this document that when we have tried to solve these problems and use the system of government that's available to us, we have the right, if after a certain amount of time the government's not listening to us, we have the right to overthrow that government and to rebel against them and form a government that will in fact give us our rights. So these are kind of the overviews of some of the main concepts that we see within the context of the Declaration of Independence. Just like to show you at this point, I made up this document, and it might be a little difficult to see entirely here, but I will make this available on Canvas for you. So I'm not going to read word for word throughout the entire Declaration of Independence, but I do want to highlight a couple of important things. As we talk here, Jefferson at the beginning of this document really focuses in on the need for us to discuss the reasons why we're splitting with Britain. They don't take this lightly. This is a matter of just feeling thoroughly rejected by the powers that be in Great Britain and feeling as though the rights as British citizens has been taken away. And they say this is a very serious business. We don't do this, just on a whim. This is something that we've thought long and hard about, and now think it's time to make the changes. So here's where much of the controversy associated with the Declaration of Independence comes in, because of the fact that we end up allowing slavery in the US Constitution, and certainly many people have not been treated equally throughout the history of American politics. But basically, in laying out the principles of what government should do, here's what Jefferson says. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights," unalienable meaning that no government can take that away from you. They exist just by virtue of you being a human being. Right? So we're all created equal. We all have rights that are there, regardless of whether the government gives them to us. That allows us to be equal. Now, he's not going to go through a whole listing of what all this means, but he says, among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? So that's kind of like, who we are as individuals, how we exist within the world. And then he goes on to really define this purpose of government that we talked about a little bit earlier, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, right? So that defines what government is all about, that we have these rights that are out there. We're all created equal. We have certain rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. and government exists to protect those rights. That's the purpose of government. And government only has powers that we as individuals give them through this concept of consent, right? So when you consent to do something, you're basically, giving your approval of something. And consent is a really big deal for the founders because they wanted to have a government that was representative of people that had given their consent. All right, so we've got A, who we are as humans. B, governments are basically founded in order to be able to deal with our rights as human beings. And then he gets to the heart of the matter right here. He says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, right? And he says, hey, but hold on here a second, can't be too rash, right? He says prudence, that recourse to I really should think really hard about this before I do something. Prudence will dictate that governments long established should be changed for light and transient causes, right? But when a long train of abuses and usurpations keeps going on, it's our right. And then he backtracks a little bit here and says, it's not just our right, it's our duty to throw off such a government. And that's what he says. So if we're going to throw this government off, hey, King, these are the reasons why. And I've added in here the number of different grievances that are listed within the context of the Declaration of Independence. So when you see these little numbers throughout here, this isn't in the original Declaration of Independence. It's just kind of the edited version that I've put together here. And what we see, I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. Talking about the king, he's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasion on the rights of the people, right? Again, we see the importance of representative democracy, that deliberation, that we've got these bodies that are supposed to make rules to help us live our lives and protect our rights. But the king has just arbitrarily come along and said, nah, they don't mean anything anymore. Whatever I want is going to be what happens, right? So again, that need for deliberative democracy. He's made judges dependent on his will alone for their tenure in offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. Again, when we think back to the idea of an independent judiciary, that independent judiciary is supposed to serve as a way to protect our rights from government. Think about that for a second. If you've got a judge who gets paid by the king, right, and can be fired if they make the wrong decision that ticks off the king, what kind of independent judiciary are you going to have? Are you going to have one that's more interested in satisfying the needs of the king or more interested in following the rule of law? And they'll obviously say it's more interested in doing what's good for the king. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. One of the great things throughout most of American history and Anglo-American history is the need to keep the military and civilian power, and that was certainly violated, and we'll see that come again in the Constitution. Now, one of the big things you probably learned in fourth grade history class was no taxation without representation. So that raises itself in the Constitution for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Again, there's that word consent. We didn't, through our legislative bodies, have the ability to be able to represent our interests, and you gave us these taxes and we didn't have any say in it. We don't like that. That's not the way government should be functioning. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally our forms of government, again, just arbitrariness. For suspending our legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Again, the recourse to this consent, to deliberative democracy is all here, right? And there are a bunch of other things that we can take a look at as we go through here. But those are the ideas behind these fundamental things that I talked about, with listing the important facets of government. And finally, we get to the end, and he says, look, I've already said we don't take this lightly, right? We've asked, we've begged at every stage of this game, and you've done nothing, right? So we must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, meaning Britain, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. So goodbye. We're out of here, right? And then we see the declaration of us as a number, a new country, having just separated. And you'll see here that, there's the recourse or the discussion of the United States of America, and then the idea of free and independent states. Exactly what this whole thing is going to look like, we don't really know. The following year, we get the Articles of Confederation, which sets us up as kind of a loosey-goosey type government with, mostly state power and not a lot of national power. But this is really the document then that sets out, A, what are our rights as human beings? B, why does government exist to protect them? C, when can we overthrow the government if they're not protecting our rights? And 4, what are the important facets of government disguised in this concept of grievances? And then at the end, declaring us as a new nation. So again, this is a controversial document throughout American history because of that all men created equal clause, and certainly open to many different interpretations as it has been. And we'll talk more about that as we go through.